Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to the Stop Overthinking podcast. This is episode 18. So this past week, I was having a conversation with a couple of women at my gym, and we got into the topic of being passive aggressive and why it seems that women do this frequently, maybe more often than men. And often the older a person gets, the more passive aggressive they seem to become. And this is all anecdotal, of course. And it just got me thinking about where passive aggressiveness comes from and what's underneath the snide remarks and why is it so prevalent for women. So started looking into this for the podcast. Just a little bit of background and definition. Passive aggression, because I'm sure you've heard of it, you've maybe even done it yourself, but it's a way of expressing negative emotions in an indirect way. So when someone is being passive aggressive, it's not talking openly about thoughts and feelings, but rather finding ways to manipulate people or a situation without directly saying what it is that you want. It's like dropping hints. So it allows the person to not deal with any sort of direct confrontation. We know this can be expressed verbally with our words, non-verbally with body language or facial expressions, or even evasive techniques, which just indicate discontent without saying a word. So the interesting thing for me was like, where does this come from? It's not a communication skill that anybody is directly taught or like you learn it in speech classes. It's a learned behavior that maybe it was modeled to you growing up, or it was something that you saw and heard from friends or coworkers or a partner. In my life coaching practice, I work with a lot of high achievers, perfectionists, people pleasers, and passive aggression and people pleasing often go hand in hand because people pleasers want to avoid confrontation. They want to be liked and accepted. And they feel like their worth and their value comes from what other people think of them. And since I work with primarily women who have generally been raised to be nice, I'm doing that in air quotes, not rock the boat, expressing negative emotions or being direct about it is often discouraged. It's not what good girls do. And so, what do you do with all of that pent up emotion? That's where passive aggression comes from. So, before I go further today, I just want to add that it's common to listen to a podcast like this and notice how other people in your life use passive aggressive behaviors. And it's tempting to point fingers at others and want them to change. Totally get it. But I encourage you to listen to this today and consider how passive aggression may be showing up for you. Okay. Don't do the passive aggressive thing and send someone a link to this podcast because you think they're being passive aggressive and need to listen to it. If you want to share the podcast in general, I always appreciate that, but keep it on the up and up. All right. So when people are passive aggressive, it's often because while growing up, it was unacceptable to express certain kinds of feelings like anger, resentment, frustration, even unhappiness or envy. They may have had a parent who didn't hear their needs or where needs didn't really matter. So we developed this learned pattern of being unassertive as a coping strategy for not being able to express your own feelings. I'm going to say that again. So passive aggressiveness becomes a learned behavior that we use as a coping strategy for not being able to express your own feelings. And as females, it's so common because somewhere along the line, you likely learned that girls should be accommodating, non-confrontational, take care of others, don't hurt anybody else's feelings. Even if you feel confident in advocating for yourself now, I'm sure you've at least heard that messaging before or maybe dealt with it before. So we know that passive aggressiveness often comes from not being able to really express our emotions. And so what happens is we bottle up all of these feelings and resentment often sets in. And I like this definition of resentment I'm going to share with you from Dr. Brene Brown. She says resentment is the feeling of frustration, judgment, anger, better than, and or hidden envy related to perceived unfairness or injustice. It's an emotion that we often experience when we fail to set boundaries or ask for what we need, or when expectations let us down because they were based on things we can't control, like what other people think, what they feel, or how they're going to react. That's big. There's a lot to unpack in there in the sense of perceived unfairness, being able to set boundaries, understanding what you can and can't control. Oh, lots there. And so it can be pretty deeply rooted and come from different places. So I personally saw passive aggression from my mom as I was growing up. For her, it was often verbal and ways for her to express discontent, but not yell and still seem somewhat nice about it. Generally, it was about how she had to do everything. My dad would work too much and she didn't feel appreciated. So as an adult, I grew up and it became more directed at me and often an expression of disapproval or criticism that if I was grateful, I would be doing it this way instead of actually saying I was ungrateful, for example. But it was conveyed to me that passive aggression is an acceptable alternative to outright anger, yelling, or criticism. And so it became something that I would pick up as well. And of course, I also saw it in, friendships, work relationships, and, then into my own marriage as well. Passive aggressiveness makes it seem like there isn't really a conflict and everything is fine. But since there isn't an acknowledgement of a problem, there also isn't a resolution. So it doesn't solve anything. So the fear of being left out sounds like I would have liked to have gone to that concert. Thanks for inviting me. So it's couched in sarcasm and is not avoiding the issue at all in avoiding conflict. Maybe there's frustration with the imbalance of household chores. And you say something like, I wish I had time to watch TV at night instead of cleaning up after dinner, whether that's to your kids or your partner. So you're not dealing with the issue. Again, might be come across as being sarcastic, but it is the perceived unfairness of, hey, I want to watch TV and I don't want to be cleaning up dinner. And why isn't anybody helping? We get here because it feels like you can't disagree because you won't be liked, loved, or respected. And so we push it down. And then it comes out as the silent treatment when you're mad that somebody can't read your mind, or the biting comments, or the memes on social media. And people pleasing and passive aggressiveness is such a problem and go hand in hand because it impacts our relationships negatively. It impacts our emotional well-being negatively. It impacts our physical well-being negatively if we stuff down too many emotions. When we don't have the conflict resolution skills, things get buried and fester. When you don't have boundaries to protect your time and energy, things get buried and fester. When we don't talk about it and just pretend that it didn't happen, even though everybody knows that it did and it still bothers you, that's a problem for relationships. And it's a problem when we're so unequipped to have a conversation that isn't quote unquote nice, that any attempt blows up into something way bigger and more hurtful than it needs to be. So, what do we do about it? First step is figuring out what the actual problem is. And sometimes this is harder than it seems on the surface because you are so used to burying the thoughts and the feelings, it may not be clear. Figuring out what the actual problem is, because the problem isn't, for example, that you have more work to do than your coworkers, or that your husband walks by the pile of laundry every day but doesn't start the load. When I ask my clients why it's a problem that, their partner walks by the laundry and they'll say, because he doesn't pick it up. Okay, but why is that a problem? And it might sound like, well, I have enough to do and he needs to help. Now we're getting somewhere. Why isn't he helping? Have you asked explicitly? Have you expressed what you need? You can always put a boundary into place of here's what you're going to do when that happens. And then it generally circles around to like, well, I shouldn't have to have that conversation. He should just know. Or we've already had that conversation and I shouldn't have to tell him again. But it comes back to what is the actual problem and why are you avoiding the actual issue? And likely it's been an issue that's simmering. And now the resentment, the perceived injustice, the frustration is clouding the entire situation. So figuring out what the problem is for you. Why is this a problem for you? Say your coworker stops you in the hall and asks you for help with an urgent project. And while you really don't want to do this, you don't feel as if you can say no. So you say, sure, no problem. Okay, which is an issue right there because it is a problem, but you agree to it. They walk on, you stalk back to your desk, you sink into your chair, and as you start shoving papers around to find, whatever documents you need, you're seething under your breath about how you already have too much to do. You didn't follow your own boundaries there. And what is the problem? Maybe it's that you wanted to avoid conflict. Maybe you're afraid of saying no. The problem isn't the other person. There are things that you can do about it. Another example, if someone in your life really upsets you, but instead of talking to them directly, you make a long post on social media and air out your anger and frustrations. Or maybe it's a vague meme. But your post, it doesn't have any identifying details, but you had just enough context that plenty of people know what you're talking about. And those who don't know might reach out and ask what's going on and whether or not you're okay. You're looking for that validation. So lots of talk about being passive aggressive and what that behavior looks like, because it can be really hard to pin down what it actually is. But common signs are refusing to discuss your concerns openly and directly, avoiding responsibility, deliberately being inefficient. It might be resorting to silent treatment or backhanded compliments, trying to get your point across. And what you can do about it when you are feeling frustrated and resentful and envious of things that other people have or say or do is always to go inward. What's underneath it? What is the problem? What are you avoiding? Because it's usually a thought or feeling that you're avoiding. And the thing is that you can't completely push the situation away. So you either have to deal with the discomfort of having the conversation or dealing with the issue, or you're going to deal with the discomfort of your own emotions, including resentment and being passive aggressive to other people. You can always go back and listen to the Boundaries podcast again, because that is going to be a big part of protecting yourself from falling into resentment, falling into the judgment and anger. Having those boundaries protects your time and your energy so that you don't fall into some of those other feelings and say things and do things that maybe aren't in alignment with the person that you really want to be. I hope you enjoyed this podcast that gave you something to think about. As always, I love your feedback, and you can send me a message or an email from my website or on social media. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Wilmer. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me with links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the